For our I.O. project, we decided to look at the relationship between the Arabs and then the French people and why that was important in the book. So we found out that, first of all, the Arab people are actually from Algeria, which is a country in the northernmost tip of Africa. And the reason that they were in France is because the French actually colonized Algeria in 1848. And so the Algerian people were being oppressed in their own country, and so they figured that a lot of them decided that they would go to France in search of better conditions economically and socially since they were being oppressed in their own country. So in the beginning, a bunch of men left on their own to go work in France, and then they would send home money to their families in the impoverished parts of Algeria, and so they would stay temporarily and then just send money to spouses and children and their mothers and stuff like that. And then later on, there was what was called a second wave of people, and that was families coming in more established groups, and they would come and they'd settle more permanently. And then later on, in like the third wave, it was allowed that the children and the spouses of the men, the males who had come over by themselves, were allowed to come as well from Algeria and then live in France. Hold on. Okay, that's pretty much it. Okay. And then the Arabs were actually never treated well by the French. They weren't treated well in their own family, in their own country of Algeria, and then they weren't treated well in France. The people saw the men as criminals, and then they also viewed them as sexual aggressors. So oftentimes they were accused of rapes and things like that of the women. And then the Arab women were seen as like clueless, kind of. They were easily taken advantage of, and they were seen as submissive. And so also they, as a whole, the people group of the Algerians, they were seen as naive and politically immature. So the government and the French people were super worried that they would be taken over by communists, that the Algerians would become communists and take over France, or that they would become crazy Algerian nationalists. So the police were really strict with the Algerians. And then once seeds of revolution began, when the Arabs began seeking their own independence, they started to impose a curfew, and the Arabs would be beaten and clubbed and drowned by the police, and then their bodies would just be thrown in the river. And then they also rounded them up, and they had identity check stations where they would even if you were a little bit Algerian, they would take you in and stuff like that. And then also they had a really hard time with being discriminated against with jobs and then housing. So with housing, they weren't seen as a developed enough people group to be housed with normal people, with the normal French people. So they kind of they were left out there, and then they had a hard time getting jobs. But the jobs that they did hold, they were mostly coal miners, or they'd work with the steel and iron manufacturing. And then they also worked with car manufacturing. And they lived in small towns called shantyvilles, or shanty towns, and because they couldn't live in normal housing, they'd craft their own little shacks out of whatever they could find, and then they would be in concentrated groups. And let's see, they lived in Marseille, Lyons, Saint Etienne, Lille, Strasbourg, and in the suburbs of Paris. So they kind of congregated together as most immigrant groups do when they first come over. I think that's it for now.
Good joke.
So Caroline's discussion of the Arabic life in France is important because it shows that wherever the Arabs were, they were mistreated, whereas the French were seen as superior to them in their own minds. So obviously, if you're a Frenchman in France, you're not going to be treated any differently than anyone else in your country, whereas an Arabic man in France is probably going to be mistreated. And also, a French man in Algeria is not going to be mistreated, even though he's not in his homeland, whereas even though an Arabic man is in Algeria, the French are still going to mistreat him because the French are still trying to colonize Algeria to be one of their own, some of their own land. So the whole reason that France was even looking at North Africa to begin with is because they had a lot of debt to pay off. So Napoleon's era clearly caused an evident amount of debt that the generations afterward would have to pay off. So for nearly a century and a half, the French are constantly trying to colonize other land and trying to find land that could be resourceful and trying to find land that they could use to make money off of. So North Africa and Algeria obviously is one place that they looked at. So part of the issue in Algeria was that the natives in Algeria wanted to preserve their own native culture, while the French were still trying to come in and to incorporate the French culture in Algeria, such as like in school systems. So kids would be Frenchmen were trying to incorporate French as a language in the Algerian school systems, even though the natives wanted the Arabic language to be primarily the language that was most focused on, which makes sense because it's their native land. But the French saw otherwise. So in 1934, there's rioters that attack Jewish shops in Constantine to riot against the government that had been starting to trying to incorporate French aspects into the area. So then a couple years later, in 1937, the Algerian People's Party is founded by Algerian nationalist Mezali Adhi, and it was operated underground, and it was a secret system in which people would plan events or plan riots to try to promote the native culture in Algeria and to try to preserve as much as they could of their homeland, as the French were trying to incorporate French aspects into that world. So then the following year, Algerian Popular Union is formed to call for equal rights for Algerian Muslims, again to preserve the native culture. So then 1939 rolls around, and France declares war on Germany, and 350,000 men from French North Africa are mobilized. So I don't know about you guys, but if someone is expected to do something by somebody else, and that somebody else happens to not treat person A with respect, chances are that person isn't going to just naturally just give in to what is being asked of them because they've never been treated the right way. So this was clearly the situation with Arabic men and natives of Algeria that were being expected to fight for France in World War II, but they had only been ever mistreated by these people that are expecting them to fight for them. So oftentimes there were riots and events that would happen in attempts to fight the French government as the French government is trying to fight this world war. So in 1942, Allied forces joined together to take control of the French Vichy administration of Algeria. This place, French Vichy administration, becomes a base for freeing the French, for free French. So more and more we see that Algeria is being taken over by the French people. However, it isn't until 1962 that France and Algeria are finally separated and Algeria gains its own independence.